Good morning. Here's Dr. Roddenberry coming to you from my home office in Willow Springs, North Carolina. How's everybody doing today? Looks like we have some viewers out there in YouTube land. Good to see you. Thanks for coming this morning. Hope everybody's doing all right. How are classes going for you? I don't know if this is your only class. Maybe you have a couple of classes this summer. Summer classes always move super duper fast, so they can be difficult to keep up with. One of the things you definitely don't want to do in a summer class is get behind. Do we have anybody in the office? Go ahead, in the audience. If you're in the audience, go ahead and type in the chat bar. Let me know who you are and how you're doing this morning. Got my cup of coffee. Enjoying coffee here, ready to talk and have some fun this morning in the psychology class. Okay, one of the things that I wanted to do before we get started is to tip you off to a really cool neuroscience website that you might find interesting. It's in your course resources folder, and it's called Neuroscience for Kids. Do not let this title scare you off and think it's immature or anything. This is actually a heck of a resource, and it's got a lot of really, really interesting stuff that I think you're going to find valuable. So if you like the stuff that I'm talking about this week and you want to know more about these topics, go to your course resources folder and check out Neuroscience for Kids. Again, don't worry about the title. I'm telling you, the information in this is just as good as the stuff you're going to find in your introductory textbook. When you click on it, it's going to take you probably to this page. What you're going to do is you're going to want to click over here where it says Explore. Click on that, and you're going to get all of these topics. Look at this. We've got the basics, the peripheral nervous system, the neuron, which we talked about. You actually might want to even go to the neuron link. And if you click on the neuron, it's going to tell you all of the different kinds of parts of the neuron. It'll talk about the synapse. You'll get a gallery of neurons where you can look at the different pictures of what neurons look like. You can go to nerve agents and learn about how chemicals, neurotoxins work on the brain to poison us. So there's lots of really, really cool stuff that I think you're going to find interesting about this website. So I invite you to check it out when you got a chance. Okay. Cool. So who do we have in the audience? I see that we have 4 viewers now. Anybody want to check in and tell me how you're doing today? I hope you can hear me. Is the sound coming through well? When I went to the screen share, were you able to hear my voice? I fixed the sound problem from yesterday, so hopefully you won't have any trouble with the sound issues as we're going along. Fantastic. Andrew says that the sound is good. Dale Ulessi, tired and blessed. I hear you, Dale. Is it work? Is that what's making you tired? Is it kids? What's getting you? Hello, Cielito. Good morning. Fantastic. Sometimes I have technical issues because I'm not the most technical guy, so occasionally I have problems that I have to figure out. Work. I hear you. Dale, where do you work? Just out of curiosity. Okay, looks like we have 5 viewers. As Dale types in where he works, Gustavo's here. Hello, Gustavo. As Dale's typing in a description of where he works, we're going to go ahead and get started. You know what? I've got a photo of a work photo. We took a work photo at Wake Tech this past spring, and I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues, if you don't mind. So let's go ahead to the PowerPoint. And I'm going to start off this PowerPoint by showing you a group photo of all my friends at work. Hey, there you go, right now. Look at that, look at that. Okay, so there's my friend Donald in the middle. I've got the number 5 on him so you can see that. That's Donald right there. If you look to the left is my friend Daphne. She's number 4. and look at that crazy guy Ted down there in the bottom, number 9. Boy, Ted is hilarious. I love the way he smiles in pictures. Absolutely hilarious, man. Holy cow. So these are some of my characters. You'll see we have Diane number one, Tina number two, uh, uh, Okalaja is number three. Do you see all my friends here? Boy, they are absolutely hilarious. What a great, fun looking group of people, huh? You know, if I was to show you this picture again, do you think you could point out my friend Ted to me? Do you think you could you could recognize Ted if you saw him again? So what's weird about this picture, folks? Can anybody tell me? If I was to show you these rocks again, being serious now, these are not my co-workers. This is actually a pile of rocks. If I was to show you these rocks and give each one of them a name, do you think you could recognize these rocks tomorrow? Of course you could. And you'd say, Chris, they all look just alike to me. Holy cow, yes, they do. The weird thing, though, have you ever noticed that faces don't? How many of you have ever run into a friend after several hours, after somebody you met after several years, and you look at them and you know you've seen them before, but you can't remember their name? In fact, most people usually say, oh, my goodness, I am terrible with names. You know what? The key is you're not terrible with names. You are actually really, really good with faces. You are absolutely awesome with faces. I don't know if you know this, but there is actually a part of your brain called the fusiform gyrus, and its sole job is to remember faces. Now, as a social animal, from an evolutionary perspective, as a social animal, it is very important for humans to be able to recognize their friends and foes, right? Wouldn't you say? So our brain actually evolved a little spot down in the bottom of the cerebral cortex called the fusiform gyrus. And it absolutely is responsible for remembering faces. Gustavo said I could only recognize it by the number. Yes, that's a great point, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second. There is actually a disorder that some people have. They're either born with a problem with their fusiform gyrus, or something happens and they have damage to their fusiform gyrus. These people have a disorder known as prosopagnosia, or face blindness. And what happens to these people is, to them, everybody's face looks as similar as a pile of rocks. So imagine, Gustavo, if you woke up tomorrow morning and you couldn't recognize your mom or your dad, even though you've known them your whole life. Every time they came in the room, you'd be like, who are you? Who are you? Imagine if all the people in your world looked as similar as a pile of rocks. Now, Gustavo mentions he could only remember them by the number. The crazy thing is, sometimes people with prosopagnosia, they have to use other cues to figure out who people are. So if like somebody has a super long hairstyle, they can remember that person, but it's not because they remember their face, but because they remember their hair. Or maybe Tina always wears these big hoop earrings, and so a person with prosopagnosia knows that the person with the hoop earrings is Tina. But if Tina comes to work and isn't wearing the hoop earrings, or if the other person with the long hair gets their hair cut short, they simply can't recognize them. Isn't that crazy? We have a spot in our brain that does that. So what we're going to do today is this week is we're going to talk a little bit. So talk a little bit about what the different parts of the brain do. Yesterday, I introduced to you to the building block of the nervous system, the neuron. And I told you that neurons communicate with each other and send information, allow us to control our body and respond to the environment. That's just the first part of the story. We're now going to take scroll out a little bit, and we're going to look at collections of neurons, and we're going to look at the brain from sort of a what you might call a organic point. We're going to look at the different parts of the brain. So let's go ahead. Now, here's what I want you to get from this class. I'm not going to be able to go into all the detail. I literally could spend probably a couple of weeks talking about different parts of the brain. So I'm going to give you just a quick overview of the brain, and then we're going to revisit it throughout the course of the semester. I want you to understand the two important principles of the nervous system. The principles are modularity and connectivity. Modularity and connectivity. Our brain is not one computing machine. It's actually hundreds of little different computing machines that each is responsible for computing a different type of task. So the brain is a bunch of little computers or modules, if you will. And then the second organizing principle is what we would call connectivity. All of these little modules are connected together so that they can work to get together to create your conscious experience. Okay, so let's start off by talking about the modular theory of brain functioning. What I want you to know is that the control of different individual bodily processes, from keeping your heart beating to solving a math problem to recognizing people's faces, are localized to different areas in your brain. One spot in your brain is responsible for moving your lips so that you can talk. Another part a little farther back in your brain is responsible for understanding grammar so that when your lips move, they put words together in a meaningful way. The back part of your brain is responsible for perceiving colors and lines and movement. And then let's see, a different part of your brain is responsible when you're focusing on my lecture. And each and every one of these parts of your brain is responsible for a specific activity. Now, if you look over here on the far right of the screen, this is the first attempt at a modular theory of brain, developed by a fellow named Franz Gall way back a couple of hundred years ago. And he pioneered a field of pseudopsychology called phrenology. And he thought that our personality was controlled in different parts of our brain. And what he would do is he would feel people's heads. And if he could feel a bump on the part of your brain, he would say that that part of the brain underneath that skull was big. And so he tried to tell you what your personality was by feeling the bumps on your head. Completely wrong. Personality is actually localized pretty much in one part of your brain, but he was right in the idea that different parts of the brain are responsible for different activities. Okay? Now, in fact, most of your bodily processes are so complex that they are not actually done in one place, but they are broken down into subtasks that then work together. For example, vision is actually processed in many different parts of your brain. For example, the occipital cortex is responsible for seeing lines and colors. And then you have a different part of your brain that's responsible for location. And then another part of your brain is responsible for figuring out the location, the color, the lines, and the shapes. What is it I'm looking at? And we're going to talk about that tomorrow night when I show you these people with brain damage. And what you're going to find out is that when somebody has damage to a part of their brain, it creates a very narrow disability in their functional abilities. So there are some people who can't recognize an object, they don't see it, but they can tell if it moves. Some people can see objects, but they can't tell when those objects move. Kind of crazy. And so what I want you to understand is the brain is a bunch of different computers. Look right underneath me. This is actually a correct map of how the brain is divided. It's was discovered by a fellow named Corbinian Brodmann, who actually went in and looked at brains with a microscope, and he found that you could divide the cerebral cortex in 52 different areas based on the observable architecture of the neurons in those brain areas. Now, we really, even to this day, we don't know what all 52 of these Brodmann areas do, but we know that these represent different functional areas in the brain. And if you Google Brodmann areas, there's actually a list you can find on Wikipedia which will tell you what each of the brain areas does that we are familiar with now. Okay, so what we're going to do today is talk about the different spots in the brain and what they do. Second organizing principle, connectivity. The brain is connected. All of these little areas are connected to one another. Now, the little areas in the brain, here's the crazy thing. Remember I was talking about neurons yesterday. You have an axon, you have a cell body, you have dendrites. Okay. Remember that. Now, if you look over here at this brain, you're looking at what's called a coronal cut. So it's somebody's brain and it's been cut off. So you're looking at this person as if you're talking to them and facing them. And what you're going to notice is that this cerebral cortex, this brain, it has two different colors. You notice it's got a darker area on the outside and it's got a lighter area on the inside. We're going to call those the gray area and the gray matter and the white matter. Now, what I want you to know is on the outside of the brain, you have all of these different modules, if you will, and each and every one of these little gray areas represents a different module of the brain that controls a different function. These gray areas are actually made up of cell bodies and dendrites. Remember from yesterday, that's the part of the neuron that's can be stimulated by chemicals and generates an action potential. These are the modules that I described on the previous slide. However, these modules need to be connected together, and they are connected together through this stuff called the white matter. And if you'll see, the white matter is on the inside. Now, why is the white matter white and not gray? It's because it's covered with that myelin tissue that I told you about yesterday, that white fatty tissue. Now, so what you see here in the white matter are all of the axons that connect these different gray areas to themselves. Now, it looks like just a big puddle of white goo, but it actually is millions and millions of neurons traveling from one part of the brain to the other. Now, if you look at that white part right in the middle, sort of that little V shape, not that V shape, but sort of that bridge thing that goes from the left half of the brain to the right half of the brain, that is a myelinated band of axons that connect the left side of your brain to the right side of the brain. It's called the corpus callosum, and it allows the left side of your brain to connect to the right side of your brain. So there are lots of connections among all of these different areas so that your modules can work together. Okay? Now, if you look right underneath me, this is what's called a diffuser tensor imaging picture, a DTI. And what this does, this allows scientists to image these connections. So if you look on this picture, you see all of these white areas in the middle, right? And you see how it looks like a pile of goo? If you use a DTI, you can see that these white piles of goo represent connections on the different parts of the brain. And there are three general types of connections in your brain. Notice the blue going from top to bottom. Those are the nerves, those are the axons that connect your brain to your spinal cord and the rest of your body. We have a set of axons that connect our brain areas to our body. And then if you look and see the red lines go left to right, and they connect the left half of our brain to the right half of our brain. And you can even see the corpus callosum. It's that big red thing going across in the top of your screen. And you can't really see it because this is a coronal cut. This person's looking right at you. But you see the little smudges of green. There are actually a third set of connections that connect the parts of each half of your brain to one another. So you have connections that connect the left half of your brain to the right half of your brain. There are connections that connect your brain to your spinal column. And then there are brains that connect the front of your brain to the back of your brain. So what I want you to know about the nervous system is that your brain is composed of lots of different modules, each responsible for a different task. And your brain, each of these models are connected by axons that allow one module to talk to another module. Now, there are some general notes about the brain that I want you to be familiar with. Your brain is divided into two hemispheres, a left side of your brain and a right side of your brain. These parts of the brain are actually not connected. They are completely separate from one another, with the exception of the corpus callosum, which is the band of tissues that connects the left half of the brain to the right half of the brain. There have been some case studies of people who have had the corpus callosum cut in half so their left half of their brain can't talk to their right half of their brain, and it causes some interesting behavioral problems for these people. Okay? Now, here's the other thing. The left half of your brain controls the right half of your body, and the right brain controls the left half of your body. This is called a contralateral design. It turns out when the brain is developing in the baby, probably I think maybe 6 to 8 weeks, the brain actually twists a little bit, and it causes the brain to be organized in such a way that the right half of the brain controls the left half of the body, and the left cerebral cortex controls the right half of the body. Very interesting. So we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere of our cerebral cortex. Now, within each of these cerebral cortexes, these cortexes are divided into four lobes of the brain. So you have a frontal lobe, a temporal lobe, a parietal lobe, and an occipital lobe on the left half of your brain. And you have a frontal lobe, a temporal lobe, a parietal lobe, and an occipital lobe on the left half of your brain. So your brain is actually divided into sort of 8 distinct parts, if you will. I mentioned the Brodmann areas, and I want you to know that there are functional areas that each control a different ability that you would have, right? And have you ever heard that term? Some people say we only use 10% of our brain. Have you ever heard that before? We only use 10% of our brain. How many of you have heard that statement? Now, from an evolutionary perspective, this is ridiculous. Why would we evolve something on our body that we don't use? Why would we evolve this big brain and only use 10% of it? Lobes, that'll work too, right? Okay. Have you ever heard that we only use 10% of our brain? That's crazy. You wouldn't evolve such a big structure. Your brain takes up 50% of your energy. Why would we create a brain and then only use 10% of it? It actually turns out that although there are functional areas in our brain, there are a lot of areas that don't have a specific function. And instead, they are the areas where the different modules will actually work together. They're called the association cortices, an association cortex. So when you see me, you see lines, shapes, and colors, but then you also have the memory of who that person is, Dr. Roddenberry. Well, you have a visual association cortex that connects your memory of my name with what I look like so that you can see me and recognize me. So there are areas in your brain that don't really do have a specific task. Instead, they are areas where different parts of your brain can work together. They're a shared workspace called association cortices. And the last thing I want to mention to you is this concept of plasticity. And this is the most amazing, bizarre part of the, Jimbo saying, apparently, according to the movie Lucy, if we use 100% of our brain, we could rewrite physics and transcend existence. Right, that's a very popular thing to say, but it's actually not true. We do use 100% of our brain. Not all the time. We're always using different parts of our brain depending upon what we're doing, but we use 100% of our brain. Great point, Jimbo. That's funny. Yeah, the movies get it wrong most of the time, right? Now, there's this concept called plasticity. Your brain, here's the crazy thing. Your brain comes partially wired. So you have the modules and you have the axons. But the connections between these brain areas and what they do is not set in stone. And what this allows to happen is if you're born and you have damage to a particular part of your brain, the function that was controlled by that part of the brain can actually move and be controlled by a different part of your brain. So the functional areas of the brain can reorganize to adapt to damage to the brain or to a missing body part. So if you're born without arms, the part of your brain that controls your arms will find something else to do. That sure doesn't work with this idea of only using 10% of your brain. You use 100% of your brain, and if the part of your body is missing that an area of your brain is supposed to control, it'll actually find something else to do. So your brain has this great plasticity. In fact, if you look in the course resources folder, there is actually a video about a fellow named Ben Underwood who lost his eyes to cancer when he was 4, and his vision area rewired with his ears, and this guy can echolocate. He can actually see with his ears. He can use sound. He walks around clicking, and he can actually build a picture from echoes of his visual world that allows him to ride a bike, play basketball, walk up and down the stairs. So this guy's brain was so plastic that when he lost his eyes as a young boy, his brain rewired so that his ears could then take over his visual center. Absolutely amazing. So I want you to know the 2 principles of the brain, modularity and connectivity. And then I want you to know these general factoids about the brain. Left half, right half. Each half is divided into four different parts called lobes, not loaves. And that each of these is a functional area. Then they communicate in these mid part areas we'll call association cortices. And your brain can rewire itself based upon damage to either your brain or your body. Crazy, isn't it? Okay, now, briefly, chapter 2 talks a little bit about brain research technologies. We actually have only begun to learn about the brain really in about the last 100 years. And really, knowing a lot about the active brain has really only um, begun to pick up speed since we've begun to use radiation and imaging technology. Okay, so the study of what different parts of the brain actually do is relatively new, and it's based upon new computer technologies that we have developed, like the CT scan, the CAT scan, the PET scan, the MRI. Some of these things that you may have heard of if you've ever been to the doctor for an injury and had an MRI or a CAT scan or a PET scan, you can actually use those same techniques to image what's going on inside the brain. So I want to spend a moment, if you will, just kind of talking about these brain research technologies. The one that's been used the longest is called the lesioning study, and these are based on case studies. We look at a person who has brain damage, we correlate that with what ability they've lost, and then we can make a pretty good guess about what that damaged part of the brain is responsible for. So, lesioning studies, famous lesioning studies that we're going to talk about at some point in this class. Paul Broca is a French doctor in the 19th century, and he had a patient named Tan. And all Tan could do was say the word Tan. That's why they gave him that nickname. He couldn't speak. He could only say one word. When Tan died, Paul Broca did an autopsy and looked at his brain and found that there was damage. There was a lesion right here in the frontal lobe. And I've got a picture of what Tan's damage would have looked like. He had this part of his brain was damaged and he couldn't form words. And so Paul Broca correctly surmised that this was a part of your brain that produces language. This is known as Broca's area. And I'm going to want you to know that for the first exam. Another famous case that you may or may not have heard of, but certainly described in your book, is the story of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker in the 19th century who suffered damage to his frontal lobe during an explosion. An iron bar that was a half-inch thick and 3 feet long. There was an explosion, and this bar was driven up through Phineas Gage's eye. It went up through his eye and blew out his frontal lobe. Phineas Gage never even passed out. He fell down, but he never lost consciousness. About 3 days later, he was up and out of bed, and pretty soon he was acting normally, as if nothing ever had happened. Can you imagine that? A steel rod going up through your brain and not killing you. He looked completely the same with one difference. His personality completely changed. And where he was a calm, mild-mannered, hardworking guy, he became a loud, obnoxious person that couldn't work and liked to fight with everybody. So we realized that the frontal lobe is where your personality is controlled. So lesioning in case studies based upon lesioning represents one of the neat new ways in which we can learn about brain damage. Now, right below me is this thing called a TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is a relatively new technique created by doctors where they can use magnetic stimulation to temporarily disable a part of your brain. So now what they can do is they can put this magnet over you, and when they turn it on for a couple of seconds and hold it right over Broca's area, you will lose the ability to speak. They can take that TMS and hold it right over your occipital lobe, your visual center, and when they turn it on, you'll go blind for a moment. And what we can do now is we can temporarily disable parts of the brain, which is kind of like a temporary lesion. You can do this. Now, you can't do a lesioning study on somebody, that's not ethical, but you can temporarily disable a part of the brain. And what these disabling studies have allowed us to do is to figure out what each of these different modules in the brain does. Okay, now the second way we can look at the brain that is really popular in sleep research is what's known as the EEG. And what they do, I don't know if any of you have ever had an EEG, but they place a bunch of electrodes on the outside of your skull. I think it's 19 of them. And if you look at the picture over here, this is an EEG readout, and see all of those little lines represents a different electrode on different parts of your brain. And what they can do is they can measure the electrical output of each part of your brain. Remember, we talked about the brain generates electricity. These neurons generate electricity. We can see what type of electrical wave is being generated by each of your brain areas. How is this interesting? Well, they have this thing called the event-related potentials study. What they can do is they measure when a different area in the brain spikes in electricity. And it turns out that when people are surprised by something, they have a spike in their electrical brain activity. And so you can measure when somebody is surprised or something new occurs. This is especially useful in infants to find out what parts of their brain are working when, because an infant can't tell you what they're experiencing, but you can measure their brain and see when an infant is surprised or when something is new to them. And we can find out what infants know and don't know by using EEGs. Now, probably the most famous use of the EEG was done by these two fellows, Kleitman and Dement, who used EEGs in sleep studies to identify this crazy thing called REM sleep. Anybody ever heard of REM sleep before? The crazy thing about REM sleep is your brain, when we go to sleep, our brain activity, the electrical waves start to slow down for a while until we go into our dream state. And when we dream, our brain is actually as active as if we were wide awake. Even though you're completely sleeping, your brain is active as if it was awake. We're going to talk about sleeping and dreaming in chapter 3. That's that's on Thursday. We're going to be talking about sleeping and dreaming, and we'll talk about the different electrical waves that occur in your brain while you are dreaming. Not RAID, but rapid. Sometimes I talk too fast. I get excited. Rapid, and I'm trying to type it. You know what rapid is. Rapid eye movement. Now, and then down here at the very bottom of your screen, you see what's known as an fMRI, a functional MRI. And basically, the functional MRI, what they do is they inject you with a dye that bonds onto glucose and oxygen and sort of the gasoline that your neurons use when they're active. And what they can do is they give you tasks while measuring you with the fMRI, and they can tell what part of your brain is active while you're doing a task. So I can sit you in front of a screen and show you a picture of your grandmother, and what I'll see is your occipital cortex and your fusiform gyrus, your visual cortex and your fusiform gyrus will activate at the same time. And I can go, wow, those two parts of the brain are active while somebody is recognizing a face. Or I could give you math problems and see your parietal lobe activate. Or I could ask you to talk, and I would see Broca's area and Wernicke's area fire up while you were saying grammatical sentences. So the fMRI allows us to see which part of the brain is active while you're doing different tasks. And all of these different techniques, the lesioning, the EEG, the TMS, the fMRI, and as I mentioned on the other page, the DTI, the diffusion tensor imaging, allow us to look inside brains and see how they are organized and what different parts of the brain are doing while we engage in our daily activities. Now, what I want to do is over the course of the semester, we're going to keep talking about different brain areas. So when we talk about memory, I'm going to talk about the different brain areas that are responsible for memory. When I talk about sleep, I'm going to talk about the different parts of your brain that are active when you're sleeping. When we talk about personality, I'm going to talk about the different parts of your brain that are responsible for your personality. And I'm going to introduce, and we're going to keep talking about all these different parts of your brain over the course of the semester. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to introduce to you the different parts of the brain today. And I'm going to ask you about a few of them on the first exam. But over the course of the exam, you're going to have to learn all of these different brain areas. It's not as hard as you think because we're going to talk about them so many, but there are about 19 or 20 areas that I want you to know when you finish this class. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the brain, and we're going to move from the oldest, most evolutionarily oldest part of your brain, the part of your brain that you actually share with lizards and snakes, and then we're going to move up to the newer parts of the brain that differentiate you from reptiles, and some of these parts of the brain even differentiate you from other mammals. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the different parts of the brain. Now, we're going to talk about the brainstem and the cerebellum. These are the parts of the brain that are the oldest. And if you think about the activities that they control, these are some of the most simple activities that we share with lizards and frogs and other older animals. Okay, so the hindbrain, oldest part of the brain, and it's the brainstem that is at the top of the spinal cord, right here in the base of your brain, and it controls your physiological responses and your physiological functioning. So look at this picture underneath me, and what I want you to notice is these first two structures, the medulla, and right above it, the pons or the pons. Now, the medulla is responsible for heart rate and breathing, some very basic physiological processes that all animals engage in. Almost all of your animals need to breathe and have a heart that they need to keep pumping to pump blood around their system. And these are the areas that the medulla controls these areas. Sometimes people overdose on drugs and they may stop breathing, right? Their heart may stop beating. These drugs sometimes, especially these sedatives, if somebody overdoses on sedatives, what it does is these sedatives, remember I told you that drugs sometimes make parts of the brain more active or less active. People who overdose and die from sedatives, what happens is they take too many sedatives, and the sedatives work in that brain stem, the medulla, and they may shut the medulla off so that it quits breathing and you die. Okay? So the medulla is responsible for breathing and heart rate. Right above that is a part of your brain that is responsible for sleep and arousal, and it helps your left and right brain coordinate their behavior together. Now, if you think about it, all animals spend time in a sleep cycle. All animals get excited and get less excited. And so the pons is the part of your brain right at the top of your brainstem that is responsible for your level of arousal during the day. Now, right behind the brainstem is this thing called a cerebellum. The cerebellum. Your cerebellum, if you think about it, when you walk, you're not just using your legs. You're using your hips, you're using your back, you're using your arm. And your legs have to work perfectly. They have to be perfectly timed for you to walk normally. Have you ever seen somebody who has trouble walking? Maybe they have brain damage, and when they walk, they look very unsteady and they have trouble moving. These people may have damage to the cerebellum. Your cerebellum really coordinates your balance and your motor movement so that you can walk really smoothly, so that you can do all the crazy complex thing you do, like having a sip of coffee while you're talking. So that's what the cerebellum is responsible for. You know what? I haven't asked this yet. Have I lost anybody yet? Bored anybody? Or is this making sense? I hope it does. Now, right at the base of your, we don't actually call this the hindbrain. It's a little bit different. But right there between your hindbrain and this cerebral cortex, which is the newest part of your body, there are a couple of structures I'm interested in. The basal ganglia and the substantia nigra. The basal ganglia is very important, and it's not included in your book, so it will not be on your exam. But the basal ganglia really helps coordinate movements. You know, when I'm walking with my feet, my arm doesn't jump up and down, right? That's because my basal ganglia tell my arm to be quiet while my legs are walking. Have you ever seen anybody with Tourette's syndrome? Does anybody know what Tourette's syndrome is? Those people that shout out and cuss randomly and that sometimes hit people and their arms flail about. they have their basal ganglia isn't working well, and so they don't control their body parts, and sometimes things will come out that they didn't want to come out, and they'll have movements that they didn't want to move. Your basal ganglia allows the coordination of movement so it can control some areas from being active while other areas are doing jobs. Now, the part that is in your book that I am interested in you knowing is this structure called the substantia nigra. This is part of your reward cycle. When something good happens, your substantia nigra is important. The thing that's important about the substantia nigra is this is where in your brain the neurotransmitter dopamine is created. And dopamine is what helps give you smooth motor movements. People who have Parkinson's disorder have damage, have the cells in the substantia nigra die, and their brain doesn't produce dopamine. And dopamine helps smooth your motor movements. And that's why people with Parkinson's disease have they shake a lot because they don't have the dopamine that works in their cerebellum to smooth out their motor behaviors. Now, your forebrain structures, and I'm running out of time, so I've got to hurry. If you look, we're going to talk about this when we get to chapter 5. Your thalamus is your sensory gateway to your conscious senses. Every conscious sense travels through the thalamus. If I can feel my arm, if I know that I'm seeing you, if I hear a noise and it comes into my brain and I know that I'm hearing something, these all travel through the thalamus. The only sense that doesn't travel through the thalamus is our sense of smell. Because it's so old, they think that maybe the sense of smell developed before the thalamus did. But your thalamus is your sensory gateway for sight, sound, touch, and taste. Now, if you look below that are these two structures, the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus helps you form new memories. If you're going to remember what I tell you for the exam, that information has to be processed by your hippocampus. Now, memories aren't stored in the hippocampus, but they go through the hippocampus. The crazy thing is, if you have damage to your hippocampus, you'll be able to remember stuff that you learned before the accident, but you won't be able to learn new things, okay? The hippocampus is kind of like the secretary that stores memories in your brain so that you can access them later. Now, attached to your hippocampus is your amygdala. It's your emotional center. It's where your basic emotions like fear and excitement and sexual energy are created. Your amygdala is actually attached to your hippocampus. You know why? Because emotional responses tell you what's important to remember. You're not going to remember the color of my shirt that I wore yesterday because you don't care about it. But if I brought a gun to class, that would excite you, scare you, make you laugh, and you would remember that. So your amygdala is your basic emotional center that creates your fight or flight response. And it's attached to your hippocampus because emotions serve as a trigger or a tag that tell us what we should remember. Okay, so I want you to know these three structures. One other structure on this page is called the hypothalamus. And your hypothalamus is responsible for regulating your sleep and wake cycle. It's responsible for regulating your body temperature. It's responsible for telling you when you're hungry or not hungry. It's responsible for managing your sexual response, telling you when you are sexually excited or not sexually excited. So it sort of regulates your motivated behavior, if you will. Now, all of these are what we call subcortical structures. They are below this big wrinkled thing we call the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the newest part of your brain. It's the part of your brain that evolved last. And in fact, this frontal lobe is the part that evolved even the latest. And this is the biggest and most complex in humans compared to other mammals. Okay. And what I want you to know for the exam, and we're actually going to talk about this more when we get to chapter 5, senses, because each of the different senses is controlled by a different cerebral cortex. But each half of your brain is divided into 4 lobes, as I mentioned earlier. You have a frontal lobe, you have a temporal lobe, a parietal lobe, and an occipital lobe. And if you see this picture right here, The orange is your frontal lobe, the purple is your parietal lobe, right underneath that is your temporal lobe in green, and your occipital lobe is in yellow. Now, just a quick quick description. Your frontal lobe is responsible for problem solving, thinking, writing a novel, studying for this test, your personality. All of that's controlled by your frontal lobe. Inside your frontal lobe is this prefrontal cortex, which is what you're using right now if you're focusing on my lecture. I told you Broca's area is responsible for moving your lips and the motor part of speech, okay, that helps you talk. And then right behind that, there's a strip in this second picture. You can see it, the primary motor cortex. That's the part of your body, that part of your brain that moves the different, that initiates the movement in the different parts of your brain. It's the part of your brain that tells you to lift your arm or start moving your leg. Now, those movements are coordinated in the cerebellum, but they're initiated in the motor cortex. All right. Now, right below and behind the motor cortex is the temporal lobe, this green structure. Now, the temporal lobe is responsible for memory. If you remember who the first president of the United States was, you're using your temporal lobe. If you remember what you did at your second birthday party, that's in your temporal lobe. I remember, who was it? Dale told me that he works in the EPA. The fact that he remembers where he works is controlled in the temporal lobe. It's for memories. But there's also a spot in your temporal lobe that processes hearing. And we'll talk about that later in chapter 5. You have an auditory cortex. And then that's actually where that fusiform gyrus that I mentioned at the beginning of the class, it remembers individual faces. Now, above the temporal lobe and behind the frontal lobe is your parietal lobe. Your parietal lobe actually orients you in space. Right now, if you would, you're sitting watching this lecture and you're nowhere near your car, but if you can, point to the direction of where your car is parked. I'm sitting in my bedroom and I can't see outside my house, but I can tell you, based on all the visual cues that I have, that my car is sort of behind me. It's at 5 o'clock and below me because I'm on the second floor. I can point to where my car is. My parietal lobe tells me where I am in space. And if I can walk to my car, my parietal lobe directs me. It's kind of my map-making part of my brain. Now, it also contains a part called your sensory cortex that is right behind the motor cortex. And whenever I feel different parts of my brain, of my body, those feelings are registered on my parietal lobe. We're going to talk about these two areas in just a second. And then at the very back of your brain is your occipital lobe, and you have a primary visual cortex, which is responsible for perceiving lines, movement, and color. And then attached to your primary visual cortex is an visual association cortex, which puts lines and colors and movement together so that you have a general picture of an object. And once you have a general picture of that object, it sends it to your temporal lobe so you can remember what that object was you saw. I know I'm speeding through this. I'm sorry I don't have 3 hours to talk. I only have 2 hours, so I'm kind of going through this a little fast. But what I want you to be able to do is to tell me what some of these areas do on the exam. I'll say this part of your brain recognizes faces. You'll say, oh, that's clearly the fusiform gyrus. I'm going to say this lobe of your brain is responsible for vision. You'll say, oh, that's the occipital lobe. So I want you to be able to do that. All right, real quick, last couple of minutes of the lecture. Specifically, your motor cortex and sensory cortex. The motor cortex is in the frontal lobe. The sensory cortex is right behind that in the parietal lobe. Now, a couple of notes I want you to know, and they're going to be on the test. The size of the functional area. So you have this little strip called the motor cortex, and you see this picture over here. And basically, each part of your body is mapped onto your motor cortex, and each part of your body is mapped onto your parietal cortex. And this is permanent, relatively permanent, unless you suffer brain damage. And so every time you activate your lips, this part of your motor cortex will move. Every time I lift my knee, this part of my motor cortex becomes active. And so you have different functional areas in your motor cortex that control different parts of your brain. Cool thing is the size of the area in the motor cortex depends upon how complex the body part is, not how big it is. So you have more area on your motor cortex for moving your mouth than you do for moving your hand or your arm, because what your mouth does is way more complex than what your foot or your elbows do. Okay? Second thing, contralateral design. When I move my right arm, my left motor cortex activates. When I move my left arm, my right motor cortex activates. Does that make sense? That's the contralateral design. And as I mentioned to you, this idea of plasticity. If a part of your body is missing, the part of the motor cortex that is responsible for moving it will actually find something else to do. So sometimes people who lose a hand or an arm will actually find that a different body part becomes develops a hyper ability. It can control itself even better than it did before. And that's because of this idea of plasticity. The brain area doesn't just say, I'm not doing anything for the rest of your life. It finds something else to do. It rewires itself. And then finally, sometimes you actually feel a body part that is missing. My dad lost his leg to cancer about 20 years ago, and his left foot, which he hasn't had in 20 years, still hurts him every day. He feels a part of his body that doesn't exist. This is called phantom limb pain. And we might even talk about this in webinar on Wednesday. There's a crazy treatment called the phantom limb pain, where you can use your eyes to trick your brain into thinking you have a body part so you can actually move it and relieve the pain. It's a crazy technique for treating people with damage to their brain. Okay, it is 9:53 and I've actually got to reset my lecture and get to my next class. I'm sorry I sped through it, but basically I wanted to give you a basic map of how the brain works. Remember, modularity. There are different parts of your brain, each responsible for very specific abilities. Breathing, moving, seeing, smelling, feeling. So there's modularity, and then each parts of these brains are connected by axons. You have connectivity. Each parts of these brains are connected so that they can work together. All right. I hope everybody enjoyed the lecture today. Do you have any questions before I go? Does anybody want to type in the chat bar? If you have a question, go ahead and type it in the bar, or just say, Chris, that was awesome. Remember, we have our first exam coming up this weekend. I'm going to be doing a review session on Friday morning at 9 a.m. on YouTube. That review session, of course, will be live and recorded. And I'm basically going to pull the exam up in front of me. You won't be able to see it, but I'm going to go through and try to be as specific as possible, telling you what things I want you to know on the exam. Okay? I'm glad you liked it, Gustavo. Wow. Did you really like it that much? Fantastic. I always like it when my lecture is good. I noticed that the number of people didn't drop off as it sometimes does, so I'm glad I kept your interest. You folks have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow morning, and we're going to start talking about this crazy thing called consciousness. And I'm going to talk about meditation and hypnosis and sleep, and we're all going to talk about that tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Until then, have a great day, and take care. Bye.